for now 10 years. Every day for 10 years, I have been bullied and attacked. And I was the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman. And I'm still here. Cruelty to get clicks, that's not going to change. To astonish a mean world with your acts of kindness, and to allow humor to lighten the burden of your tender heart.
In her delusional state, that just because she wants everybody to think how wonderful she is, that people are going to ignore the evidence of her.
10 years. Every single day for 10 years, Meghan Markle claims she has been bullied and attacked. Not just bullied in the ordinary sense that many public figures experience criticism and scrutiny as part of life in the public eye, but bullied in a way so extreme, so relentless, and so uniquely targeted that she has declared herself, without apparent hesitation or embarrassment, the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman, the most trolled person on the entire planet. And she is still here, still standing, still smiling for the cameras, still selling pantyhose on her new lifestyle website, still attending universities in Australia to deliver carefully scripted speeches about mental health and the dangers of social media, while simultaneously launching a social media platform of her own. The layers of contradiction embedded in this particular performance are so numerous and so densely packed that it is genuinely difficult to know where to begin unpacking them. But begin we must, because what Meghan Markle delivered on day 3 of her Australian tour was not a speech about online safety or mental health or kindness. It was a masterclass in calculated victimhood, delivered with theatrical precision to an audience of university students who deserved far better than to be used as props in yet another chapter of the Sussex Image Rehabilitation Project. Let us be entirely clear about what this Australian tour has been from the beginning. It was sold to the media, to the public, and apparently to the couple themselves as a humanitarian visit, a chance for Harry and Meghan to reconnect with a country that holds special significance for them, to engage with charitable causes, to meet ordinary people, and to demonstrate through their actions that they remain committed to the kind of public service that justified their royal status before they walked away from it. That was the framing. That was the story the couple's public relations apparatus worked overtime to establish and to protect. And for the first 2 days of the tour, that framing held, imperfectly, controversially, and in the face of significant criticism, but it held well enough to generate the sympathetic headlines and the favorable television coverage that was clearly the primary goal of the exercise. Then day 3 arrived, and with it, the mask began to slip in ways that even the most determined Sussex apologist would have struggled to explain away. The centerpiece of day 3 was Meghan's appearance at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, where she addressed students on the subject of mental health and the pressures of social media. On the surface, this was entirely consistent with the humanitarian narrative the couple had been working so hard to construct throughout the tour. Mental health is a cause Harry has championed publicly and loudly for years. Online safety and the psychological damage inflicted by social media platforms are subjects of genuine and urgent public concern. A speech at a university, directed at young people who are navigating these challenges in real time, sounds like exactly the kind of meaningful engagement that a self-described humanitarian couple ought to be undertaking. Sounds like, because what the speech actually contained, when you strip away the carefully chosen words and the practiced emotional delivery and the strategic deployment of a quote from a little bag given to her by a friend, was a series of claims about Meghan's own suffering so extravagant and so demonstrably disconnected from any verifiable reality that they left observers across the political spectrum shaking their heads in disbelief. 10 years of daily bullying. The most trolled person in the world, man or woman. People who actually wanted her to die. These are the claims Meghan made, in her own words, to an audience of university students in Melbourne. And she made them not as passing references or contextual background, but as the emotional and rhetorical foundation of her entire speech. The argument she was constructing was essentially this: I have suffered more than almost anyone alive from the cruelty of the internet. I have endured it for a decade. I am still standing, and therefore I am qualified to tell you that you can endure it too. The motivational logic is straightforward enough. The problem is that every single premise on which that logic rests is, at best, wildly exaggerated and, at worst, a straightforward and deliberate lie. Let us start with the numbers. The claim to be the most trolled person in the entire world is not a modest one. It is, in fact, one of the most extraordinary claims any public figure has made in recent memory about their own experience of online abuse. The world contains billions of people who use social media. It contains journalists, politicians, activists, athletes, musicians, and ordinary private individuals who have been subjected to online harassment campaigns of truly devastating intensity and duration. It contains women who have been targeted by coordinated abuse movements that have driven them from their homes. It contains public figures in authoritarian countries who face not just online abuse, but the genuine threat of physical violence and imprisonment as a direct consequence of that abuse. The idea that Meghan Markle, a wealthy, powerful, well-resourced woman living in a $10 million mansion in Montecito, California, surrounded by security personnel, with access to the best legal representation money can buy, and a global media platform that allows her to reach hundreds of millions of people whenever she chooses, is the most trolled person in the world is not just implausible. It is an insult to the genuine victims of online abuse, whose suffering bears no resemblance whatsoever to Meghan's comfortable and pampered existence. Then there's the question of what Meghan actually means when she talks about being trolled, because her definition of trolling, as it has emerged over the course of many interviews and speeches and carefully managed media appearances, appears to include something rather broader than most people would recognize. It appears to include critical journalism. It appears to include commentary and analysis that reaches conclusions she disagrees with. It appears to include the ordinary and entirely legitimate public scrutiny that comes with being a member of one of the most famous families in the world. When Harry and Meghan talk about the media treating them badly, they're not talking exclusively or even primarily about anonymous social media users sending abusive messages. They are talking about reporters, editors, and commentators doing their jobs, asking questions, investigating claims, and publishing findings that the couple would prefer remained unpublished. Conflating those two things, as the couple has done repeatedly and consistently, is not an honest mistake. It is a deliberate rhetorical strategy designed to make legitimate journalism appear indistinguishable from harassment and abuse. Charlotte Griffiths, the editor-at-large of a Mail on Sunday, made exactly this point in a television appearance following Meghan's university speech. Though it must be noted, for the sake of complete accuracy and transparency, that GB News chose to feature Griffiths in this capacity without disclosing to viewers the personal connection she has to Prince Harry from their earlier relationship. That omission matters because it speaks to a broader pattern of compromised and undisclosed interests that pervades the media coverage of this couple on all sides. But the substance of what Griffiths said was valid regardless of her personal history. She noted that Meghan has repeatedly and publicly claimed not to read social media, not to engage with Twitter or other platforms, and not to expose herself to the online commentary that supposedly causes her so much pain. If that is true, if Meghan genuinely does not read social media, then the source of her knowledge about the trolling directed at her must be other people telling her about it. And if the source is other people, then the claim to have experienced 10 years of daily bullying becomes still more difficult to sustain with any credibility. Griffiths also made a point about the history of media coverage of Meghan in this country that deserves to be repeated and emphasized. When Meghan Markle first appeared on the public stage as Prince Harry's girlfriend, and then as his fiancée, and then as his wife, the British media, including the newspapers that Harry and Meghan now describe as instruments of their persecution, covered her with warmth, enthusiasm, and genuine goodwill. She was celebrated. She was praised. She was described as a breath of fresh air, a modernizing force, a woman who brought new energy and new perspectives to an institution that many felt had become too rigid and too remote. The critical coverage that followed was not the starting point of the relationship between Meghan and the British press. It was a response to inconsistencies in her public statements, to the treatment of staff members who left her employ, to the contradictions between her public messaging and her private behavior, and to the growing sense among journalists who covered the royal family that the story being presented to the public bore little resemblance to the reality they were observing. Harry's contribution to Day 3 of the Australian tour was no less troubling, and in some respects rather more so, because it involved a subject that carries genuine emotional weight and genuine public sensitivity. Speaking at the Entourage Summit at Melbourne Park, an event that had reportedly struggled to sell out its relatively modest capacity, and for which Harry was receiving a reported speaking fee of $50,000, the Duke of Sussex made statements about the death of his mother, Princess Diana, that were by any honest assessment deeply disingenuous and intellectually dishonest. He claimed that Diana's death was the reason he had wanted to leave royal life. He said that after losing his mother just before his 13th birthday, he felt that the role was headed somewhere he did not want to go, that it killed his mother, and that he had stuck his head in the sand for years before eventually coming to the realization that leaving was not just what he wanted, but what Diana herself would have wanted for him. This is a narrative that requires very careful and very critical examination, because the use of Princess Diana's memory to justify Harry's decision to abandon the royal family, to move to America, to spend years attacking his family members in interviews and memoirs and Netflix documentaries, and to make millions of dollars in the process, is something that those who knew Diana well have consistently and forcefully rejected. The idea that Diana, a woman who devoted her life to the institution of the monarchy even as she struggled with the personal costs of that devotion, who fought to ensure that William and Harry were raised with a clear sense of their royal identity and responsibility, would have wanted Harry to do what he has done, to walk away, to attack, to monetize, and to perform victimhood on an international stage, is not supported by anything we know about who Diana was and what she valued. It is, as commentators have noted with increasing frequency and increasing frustration, a rhetorical device. Diana cannot speak for herself. She cannot correct a record, and so her memory is deployed, again and again, as a shield against criticism and a justification for behavior that would otherwise be very difficult to defend. The reaction to both speeches from observers who have been following this tour was swift and pointed, the pattern that critics had identified from the very first day of the visit. A pattern of presenting two very different and mutually contradictory versions of themselves, switching between triumphant quasi-royal figures and persecuted victims, depending on what the moment called for, was now impossible to ignore even for those who had been trying to give the couple the benefit of the doubt. As one commentator put it with admirable concision, the first 2 days of the tour had been about cashing in on the residual glamour and status of being royal adjacent, and day 3 had pivoted sharply back into the well-worn narrative of the royal family treating them terribly and the world conspiring against them. The pivot was jarring. It was also, in its own way, revealing, because it suggested that the couple and their team had not yet found a coherent or sustainable public identity that does not depend on either borrowing from the monarchy they abandoned or attacking it. The fashion dimension of the tour, which might under different circumstances be a trivial sideshow, became on day 3 something rather more pointed and rather more symbolic, because Meghan Markle arrived at Swinburne University wearing pantyhose. This would be entirely unremarkable were it not for the fact that Meghan Markle has previously spoken at some length about pantyhose as a symbol of the inauthenticity forced upon her by royal life. In the specific quote that circulated widely after her university appearance, she described being required to wear pantyhose during her time as a working royal as something that felt a little bit inauthentic, a small but telling example, in her own framing, of the way in which royal duties constrained her ability to express her true self. And yet here she was, in Australia, on a tour that she and Harry have positioned as a celebration of their freedom and their authenticity, wearing pantyhose, to a university speech. The irony was not lost on observers, who noted with varying degrees of amusement and exasperation that the woman who had made pantyhose a minor but memorable symbol of royal oppression had apparently decided that authenticity, on this particular occasion, required precisely the garment she had so memorably denounced. The context for the pantyhose reappearance is also worth noting, because it speaks directly to what this tour is actually about at its commercial core. Meghan has recently launched a new website and lifestyle brand called WOM, which appears to function as a platform for selling or promoting various products and outfits, including clothing that Meghan herself wears during public appearances. The Australian tour, with its extensive media coverage and its many photographed appearances, functions in this context not just as a humanitarian exercise or a public relations campaign, but as a product showcase. The outfits Meghan wore during the tour were being offered for sale on the website in real time, allowing consumers to purchase the same clothing they were seeing on their television screens and social media feeds. This is a business model that is entirely legitimate in principle, but that sits in profound and uncomfortable tension with the framing of the tour as an expression of humanitarian values and genuine public service. You cannot simultaneously present yourself as a selfless advocate for the vulnerable and operate what amounts to a celebrity merchandising operation using your charitable engagements as the marketing vehicle. The contradiction is too large and too obvious to be explained away. The walkabout scenes from day 3 added further texture to the picture that was emerging. In footage that circulated widely, Meghan appeared visibly irritated during portions of her public engagement, with a member of her team at one point visibly signaling to members of the public to give her more space. The moment was brief but telling, a flash of the controlled and boundary-conscious management that characterizes Meghan's relationship with the public even during events that are nominally designed to be warm and spontaneous encounters with ordinary people. There was also a notably awkward interaction with a young boy who was presented with a question about a children's book, a moment that was clearly intended to produce the kind of charming and heartwarming footage that press teams dream about, but that instead produced visible discomfort and a response from Meghan that struck observers as impatient and slightly dismissive. The media coverage of the tour, and in particular the work of certain Australian television journalists, became a story in its own right by day 3. A reporter for Channel 7 in Australia, who had been embedded with the couple for the duration of their Melbourne visit, became the subject of widespread criticism after footage emerged of him engaging in what many observers described as embarrassingly sycophantic behavior toward Harry and Meghan. The reporter in question appeared to take considerable pride in a brief personal interaction with Harry during the couple's departure from one of their engagements, describing in some detail how Harry had complimented his smile and expressed affection for his tie. His subsequent defense of this behavior, in response to reports describing the interaction as an attempt to take selfies with the couple, managed only to deepen the impression of a journalist who had allowed personal enthusiasm for his subjects to override the professional detachment that serious reporting requires. He was, in the bluntest terms, praised for his role as a propagandist by the very subject of his reporting, and he accepted that praise without apparent discomfort. Lady Colin Campbell, the author and royal commentator who joined the discussion of these events with her characteristic directness and acerbic precision, was unsparing in her assessment of Meghan's victimhood claims. She made a point that deserves to be stated clearly and at some length, because it cuts to the heart of what is most dishonest about the narrative Meghan has been constructing. Nobody, Lady Colin observed, is asking Meghan to share her feelings, her experiences, or her perspective on a daily basis. Nobody is compelling her to appear before university audiences, to give Netflix interviews, to publish memoirs through her husband, to launch podcasts and lifestyle brands and social media platforms that continuously insert her into the public conversation. She does all of these things by choice. She seeks attention by choice. And having sought that attention, having put herself before the public on her own terms and in her own carefully curated presentation, she then complains that the public's response to her, including the critical, skeptical, and sometimes hostile response, constitutes bullying and trolling and persecution. The logic does not hold. You cannot simultaneously demand the spotlight and complain about being seen. The claims about Princess Diana's death that Harry made at the summit provoked Lady Colin Campbell to offer some important historical context that has been largely absent from the mainstream coverage of Harry's evolving Diana narrative. She addressed the circumstances of Diana's death with a directness that many find uncomfortable, but that the historical record, she argues, requires. The assertion that the media killed Diana, which underpins Harry's claim that royal life killed his mother and therefore justified his departure from it, involves a significant simplification of what actually happened on the night of August 31st, 1997. The vehicle Diana was traveling in was driven at high speed through a Paris tunnel by a driver who was over the legal alcohol limit. Diana was not wearing a seat belt. These are established facts. They are not comfortable facts, and they do not diminish the grief of those who loved her or the tragedy of her loss. But they are facts that matter when evaluating the claim that media pursuit was the cause of her death. And they complicate the narrative in ways that Harry's use of Diana's memory consistently and conveniently ignores. What this tour has demonstrated, across all 3 days and across all of its many carefully staged and meticulously managed engagements, is that Harry and Meghan have not found a sustainable public identity. They are caught between two versions of themselves that cannot be reconciled. The quasi-royal humanitarians who walk through hospital wards and speak at summits, and the persecuted victims who have been trolled for a decade and whose lives have been made unbearable by the cruelty of the world. The first version requires the status and the imagery of royalty without the accountability. The second version requires a level of genuine suffering that their actual circumstances, the mansion, the staff, the security, the speaking fees, the Netflix deals, the lifestyle brand, simply do not support. Until they find a third version, one that is honest about who they are and what they are doing and why, the gap between the performance and the reality will continue to be visible, and audiences in Australia and everywhere else will continue to notice. And so the Australian tour of Harry and Meghan draws toward its close, leaving behind it a trail of questions that no amount of managed media coverage can suppress. What was the purpose of this visit? Who authorized the lining up of sick children in a hospital atrium for a photo opportunity? Who decided that a university speech about online bullying was the right vehicle for Meghan's most sweeping claims, yet about her own suffering? Who approved the security arrangements, and who will ultimately pay for them despite the couple's assurances? These questions point toward a pattern of conduct deeply familiar to anyone paying honest attention. A pattern of using other people's pain and goodwill as raw material for a personal brand built on a language of service, but driven entirely by self-promotion. The tour will end. The cameras will move on. But the record remains.